The scene started innocuously. Mercedes had qualified on the front row at Spain, and Nico Rosberg actually won the race, their first victory in over a year.
Tonight, Lewis Hamilton, pole position today. Bottas crosses the line. He's a 10th down.
But the spectacle hid a nasty secret. In the race, Hamilton's car had suffered catastrophic tire loss.
Into the pits anyway comes Lewis Hamilton. He goes straight on into the gravel trap. Can he keep the wheels spinning?
Forcing him to nurse worn tires for almost the entire distance. By the end, he had been lapped and limped across the line in 12th. Rosberg, who had started on pole, was a full minute behind the leader. In F1, such tire eating is a disaster, and Mercedes knew they needed answers fast. To others, the solution would sound logical. Pirelli needed data, and Mercedes needed tires. Under Pirelli's FIA contract, up to 1,000 kilometers of testing were allowed per season, but only if every team had the chance. Mercedes and Pirelli hatched a plan. They stayed in Barcelona on 15th to 17th May and ran the team's current 2013 car on special development tires for 3 days straight. Hamilton and Rosberg took turns on track,
Turn 1, ahead of Lewis Hamilton.
ticking off lap after lap to feed data back to the engineers. Even as engines roared in the Catalan heat, from the outside it looked like a normal weekend. Mechanics shuffled trailers and slicks into the garage, just as they would for any Grand Prix. Hamilton and Rosberg drove in the early morning and late afternoon, both wearing plain black unmarked helmets, so nobody would eyeball who was in the cockpit. No press teams were invited, no photos were shared, and the paddock chatter was minimal. Yet all was not as it seemed. By the Monday evening after Monaco, the very next race, rumors of the secret test had spread like wildfire. One well-informed report later confirmed that Mercedes had actually checked with race director Charlie Whiting before running the test, and Whiting had given a qualified approval, so long as the test was fair to everyone. In fact, that account says Pirelli had at least asked the other teams if they'd be interested, and Mercedes believed that was sufficient notice. In short, the Silver Arrows thought they had cleared the plan, but no explicit confirmation had been given to all teams. Tire troubles spark desperation. Why did Mercedes risk this if it was so borderline? The answer lies in the tire situation. The 2013 W04 had a ferocious appetite for rear rubber, far worse than expected. Paul Hemberry of Pirelli admitted he was surprised by how quickly the Mercedes tires shredded. The team's engineers saw rear tires peeling off in big chunks, and both cars were sliding around desperately in the race. In hindsight, Mercedes insisted they were actually doing a public service for F1. Their test would gather crucial data to prevent any dangerous tire failures in races. But that message fell on deaf ears outside the garage. Rivals saw only a blatant rule bend. On Saturday in Monaco, Red Bull racing director Christian Horner lit the fuse. He told reporters flatly,
and then he hits the debris and picks up a puncture.
"They have run a current car with current drivers and current tires. That's a clear breach." Horner continued, "It's not right for a current team to test a current car on tires we're going to be racing on here." His words stung. Everyone knew Red Bull had lobbied for strict testing restrictions next year, only to find them possibly breached by Mercedes. Helmut Marko, Red Bull's senior advisor, echoed the anger in strong terms. He reminded everyone that after 3 days of testing, you are roughly a second a lap quicker, and pointed out that in Monaco, after the test, Mercedes had no tire problems. That's no accident. Essentially, he accused Mercedes of buying a huge head start in development. By Sunday evening in Monaco, the paddock had flipped from celebration to confrontation. Journalists were scribbling about penalties instead of podium glitz. The Guardian captured the mood. Rosberg's victory had been overshadowed by claims of illegal testing. Ferrari added to the pressure by quietly submitting its own protest over the tire test. With two teams officially objecting, there was no way the FIA could ignore this. The secret 3-day test. Let's dig into exactly what happened in Barcelona on those 3 days. All signs suggest Mercedes and Pirelli went all in. According to later accounts, they assembled a full pit operation at Circuit de Catalunya. Fuel rigs, engineers, trucks of tires, and data loggers, as if it were a regular race weekend. Hamilton drove steady warm-up laps in the morning. Rosberg took over in the afternoon. Both drivers used their normal race pace to stress the tires. By the end of May 17th, roughly 1,000 kilometers had been covered, including several full-distance runs. The only oddity was the helmet covers. Mercedes went to great lengths to obscure who was really in the car. Paul Hembury later insisted the test was entirely about tire development and that Mercedes literally had no clue what compounding Pirelli was focusing on. He claimed Pirelli's engineers chose the tire parameters, and Mercedes merely provided the car and data collection. Pirelli's idea, he said, was similar to how tire testing works in rally. A competitor team's car is used to gather data for next year's rubber. He even explained that 90% of the work was for the 2014 tires, suggesting any advantage for 2013 was unintentional. The contract details mattered. Under FIA Rule 22.4, in-season testing with a current car was otherwise forbidden. The only allowable in-season track runs were limited young driver tests or specific approved events, none of which this Barcelona session was. That is why Red Bull and Ferrari were so outraged.
You know, in a history, things change, and
They saw this as literally the kind of test the rulebook banned. They pointed out that no one except Mercedes was doing any other tire development tests at this time. Some of the paddock grumbled that Red Bull's protest may have been partly self-serving. The journalist Joe Sayward remarked that Red Bull might be upset simply because they weren't asked to participate. He even claimed Red Bull had politely declined when offered the chance, then complained once Mercedes went ahead. That rumor only added color to the story. In any case, whether by foul play or oversight, the test had happened, and Mercedes was now squarely in the crosshairs. The paddock reacts. The allegations spread fast. The very next day, Red Bull and Ferrari had lodged formal complaints with the stewards. Horner told Sky Sports, "We have protested because it was not in line with the regulations." He called the manner of the test underhand and making a mockery of the rules. Ferrari's protest was more muted publicly, but no less firm. Their team boss pointed out that all teams are supposed to be equal under these rules. If one team could do this, so could any other. Media outlets ran scathing headlines. One F1 blog cracked that the real scandal was how teams get upset when they don't get an invite. Social media lit up with debates. Fans joked, "Imagine if Red Bull had done this test, would the sky fall?" The consensus was that Mercedes had clearly broken the letter of the testing ban, and only a lenient administration would let them skate. Even within the FIA, people took notice. Initially, race director Whiting had simply continued with the Monaco event without comment. But by Sunday night, the FIA put out a formal statement. It confirmed Pirelli had indeed asked for a test and had been advised by the FIA that it could proceed only under the rules. The FIA also openly noted that no evidence was provided showing every team had been invited. That language, especially the reminder that all teams must be offered any test, was a clear warning signal that Mercedes had crossed a line. The FIA steps in. With the protests lodged, the FIA wasted no time. They announced that an international tribunal would convene on June 20th to 21st, 2013. Suddenly, one of the sport's mightiest teams was in a formal hearing, with real stakes. Speculation ran wild. Could Mercedes lose their Spanish race win? Could the team be docked points or even banned from the championship? By regulation, anything was possible. Reuters noted that technically the panel could strip points or suspend Mercedes for a race, though it cautioned that punishing a top team so severely was historically unlikely. Behind the scenes, both camps prepared their briefs. Mercedes dug up emails and minutes showing they had indeed asked Whiting for permission. Pirelli lined up copies of their FIA contract clauses that allowed the 1,000-kilometer test. Red Bull and Ferrari scoured the sporting regulations and witness statements for contradictions. In public, team representatives stayed polite. "We'll respect the FIA's process," they all said. But the tension was undeniable. By the time the hearing began, F1's attention was split evenly between the courtroom news and the next on-track action. The Tribunal Showdown. In a packed room in Paris, Mercedes and Pirelli put their case forward against the protest from Red Bull and Ferrari. Mercedes lawyer Frank Harris emphasized the team's intentions. He argued bluntly that the sole motive was tire safety. "Our motivation was safety," he said, and that Mercedes had acted on the understanding they had approval. Indeed, Evidence was presented that Mercedes had reached out to Whiting and been given a green light of sorts. Harris even reminded the panel that Ferrari had helped Pirelli earlier in the year. In April, Ferrari ran over 620 miles for tire testing with Massa. He noted, the implication was that if Ferrari could test with their old car, why should Mercedes be punished for helping? The FIA's lawyer, Mark Howard, argued back forcefully. He pointed out that the agreed plan was fundamentally unfair. By putting both Hamilton and Rosberg on track for 620 miles, Mercedes may be said to have obtained an unfair advantage, he told the hearing. Howard highlighted that no other teams were informed. None of the other teams was invited to the testing, and none was aware it was taking place. In his view, even if the intent was safe, the act clearly violated Article 22.4. Pirelli's representatives stressed they too had believed they were following the rules. They argued that they had only ever asked fair questions and were simply trying to fulfill their tire development duties. In closing, Pirelli's spokespeople downplayed any advantage. After all, the drivers didn't know what compounds they were on until after the test. Their stance was essentially, we thought this was allowed by contract, and we did everything we could to stay within the spirit of the agreement. After 7 hours of arguments, the tribunal retired to decide. When the verdict emerged, it was a compromise of sorts. The judges found that Mercedes had technically broken the in-season testing ban. Running a current car and drivers outside allowed windows was against the rulebook. However, and crucially, they also found that Mercedes had not intended to obtain any unfair sporting advantage by the act. Both Mercedes and Pirelli were judged to have acted in good faith and truly believed they had FIA approval. In practical terms, this meant the punishment was minimal. The FIA announced that Mercedes and Pirelli would be reprimanded, a formal warning, and that Mercedes would lose access to the upcoming 3-day young driver test. In effect, Mercedes was told, don't do this again, but no World Championship points were taken away. A Reuters headline summed it up. Mercedes had managed to escape heavy sanctions with only a slap on the wrist. One tiny consequence fell on Mercedes' junior driver program. Sam Bird had been scheduled to drive the car at Silverstone, but he missed that chance due to the ban. Otherwise, the team's championship standings remained intact. Toto Wolff publicly stated he was satisfied that the tribunal recognized Pirelli's good faith, and Mercedes quickly refocused on their on-track battles. The aftermath and legacy. In the weeks that followed, most in F1 moved on. Everyone has a race to win. Yet the story lingered as an odd footnote of 2013. Red Bull and Ferrari remained under a cloud of frustration, convinced the stewards had let Mercedes off too lightly. Fans and pundits debated fairness endlessly. Some said Mercedes had found a clever loophole. Others said they'd flouted the rules and got lucky. One insider wryly noted that Red Bull's ire was partly because they had been offered the chance to run that test and had declined. The most concrete outcome was a change in the rules. In 2014, the FIA formally reintroduced limited mid-season tire tests, but with strict rotation. Each team would get an official session so no one team could claim an exclusive advantage. This was precisely to close the loophole that had caused the 2013 uproar. In other words, F1 regulators essentially said, we heard your protests, but here's a new, fair system. Today, the forbidden test is a classic controversy in F1 lore. It serves as a reminder of how closely teams push the boundaries. Mercedes took a big risk that weekend. They nearly lost their Spanish win over it. But in the end, their gamble paid off. No points were lost, their championship charge continued, and the sport fixed the rules to keep things honest next time. So what do we take away? It depends on your view. Some see it as clever resourcefulness. Mercedes believed they had FIA backing, ran the test, and politely accepted the scolding when caught. Others see it as bending the rules. They did something most teams wouldn't dare. The lingering question, in motorsport, how do you define cheating, was never fully answered. In the end, the forbidden tire test remains an unforgettable story. It had the hallmarks of a Hollywood plot: secrecy, betrayal, a tribunal, and a surprisingly gentle finale. And it leaves us wondering, was Mercedes really breaking the spirit of the rules, or just finding a gray area that nobody enforced until it was too late? The debate goes on, as will the memory of that odd weekend when one of Formula One's top teams quietly tested behind everyone's back and essentially got away with it.